Lovely to see you all. My name's Rose Drew. I'm CEO of Interfaith Glasgow, and a very warm welcome on behalf of Interfaith Glasgow to the third event in our series, Voices from the Portal, Reimagining Our Post-Pandemic World. Thank you for being here, and a very happy Scottish Interfaith Week to you all. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, Interfaith Glasgow promotes and facilitates friendship building, dialogue and cooperation between people from diverse religion and belief backgrounds. Now, before the pandemic, I would have added that we do this in Glasgow, but of course, one upside of the need for social distancing is that we've been able to engage speakers and participants at our events and activities from around the world, which has been wonderfully enriching. So there are some upsides. Our Voices from the Portal series invites people of all faith and belief backgrounds to come together to reflect on some of the key issues that have been highlighted by the pandemic, to consider what we've learned, what opportunities have emerged, and what changes we want to see in relation to key issues ranging from poverty, racism and the climate crisis, to mental health, changes in religious practice, and today, the cultivation of kindness. Now, Interfaith Glasgow, of course, is not alone in hosting conversations about how we build back better after the pandemic. But our particular interest is in making space for conversations in which a variety of religion and belief perspectives can be heard, and in creating opportunities for people to engage intentionally and deeply across religious and cultural boundaries when addressing important issues that affect us all. As I've explained at the start of previous events in this series, the series title Voices from the Portal was inspired by the words of Indian writer Arundhati Roy. In case this is the first time that you've attended one of these events, I'll read again the brief passage from which those words come. She writes, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." So this evening offers another opportunity for us to come together, to listen deeply to each other, and to try to imagine that better world that it's worth fighting for. This evening, our focus is on kindness. From the devastating loss of loved ones and physical health to the profound impact of COVID-19 restrictions on financial stability, emotional well-being, and mental health, the pandemic has caused tremendous and ongoing suffering. But in response to this suffering, we've also seen a tremendous outpouring of kindness. Back in March, more than 560,000 people in the UK signed up as NHS volunteers. And a new study suggests that as many as 5 million UK residents signed up to be charity volunteers of one kind or another. The same study found that during the pandemic, around 10% of adults surveyed had offered their time to a charitable organisation for the first time in their lives. And 50% claimed to have realised the importance of community and to have a greater intent to help as a result of the pandemic. Moreover, 14% had given more money to worthy causes than they usually would have done, despite the financial insecurity that the pandemic has caused. Over the past few months, we've all seen countless examples of individuals offering their time and skills to help others in all sorts of ways, from shopping for vulnerable people, making free meals for those in need, or helping out at food banks, to making PPE and face masks, joining befriending schemes, or undertaking personal challenges in order to fundraise for the NHS and other good causes. Most of you probably know about 100-year-old war veteran Captain Tom Moore, who raised more than 32 million for the NHS by walking laps of his garden. But you might be less familiar with 100-year-old Dabar al-Islam Chowdhury, who, inspired by Captain Moore, also raised a huge amount of money for the NHS by walking laps of his garden while fasting during the Islamic holy month of Ramadan. Thanking his donors, Chowdhury reflected, "We have proved that we can stand hand to hand and shoulder to shoulder during the most unprecedented time of our lives." It seems that in many ways, the pandemic has been bringing out the best in people. But how do we make that stick? How do we avoid burnout or compassion fatigue, especially as disagreements over appropriate lockdown measures abound and other political issues threaten to divide us? Moreover, while it's one thing to be good in a crisis, what happens when the pandemic is over? How do we stay true to our realizations of the importance of community and our intentions to help others? Is it possible for us to actively nurture kindness within ourselves and others? Dr. Jyoti Johal is a senior lecturer in Sikh studies at the University of Birmingham. She has over 20 years experience in teaching and research and has extensive knowledge and experience in Sikh theology, interfaith dialogue, and contemporary issues facing the Sikh community. Her research covers issues of gender inequality, Sikh identity in the diasporic community, mental health, representation within Gurdwaras, racialization and mistaken identity, as well as other contested issues that confront the Sikh community nationally and globally. She works with the Edward Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion, was a commissioner on the Wolf Institute's Commission on Religion and Belief in Public Life, and is also very much involved in voluntary work within the community, especially around gender and children's issues. You might know her as a presenter on the Thought for the Day segment on BBC Radio 4's Today programme. Dr. Jyoti Johal, you are most welcome. Over to you.
Right. Thank you, Rose. So I'm going to talk about kindness through the Sikh concept of seva. November is an important month for Sikhs. It marks the birth anniversary of Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh tradition. His universal message to humankind is to live a life of service is highly relevant today. One of the first stories that Sikhs learn about his life recounts that, as a boy, Nanak's father gave him some money to go and invest in the town. Nanak walks to the town and on his way comes across a group of 20 spiritual saints, sadhus, who he sees need to be fed. So he uses his money to feed the group of saints, who don't ask to be fed, important to note. When he returned home, his father was furious when he learned that his son had not invested the money, but had fed the hungry. Nanak's response was, what could be a better investment than giving to those who need more than us? That is the true investment. And in Punjabi or Gurmukhi, it means Sacha Sota. This story to date is invoked by Sikhs to emphasize the importance of charitable giving and of recognizing one's own privilege. Guru Nanak teaches that to achieve liberation of the soul and ultimate union with God, the true seekers have to live according to three core principles. Naam Japan, which means recitation of God's name, Geet Karan, which means earning an honest living, and Vand Shakana, which is selfless service. These are both internal and internal practices that enable spiritual growth and facilitate moral and ethical living. They emphasize that an individual's social responsibility in this world is to ensure the well-being of society. The Guru Granth Sahib also notes, practice truth, contentment, and kindness. This is the most excellent way of life. There is an emphasis also on sincere worship and serving God through seva, through altruism, both of which are difficult to achieve due to ego and self-centeredness. Ego within Sikhism is Hamai. The external action of seva is essential for those who search for a seat in God's court. True worship consists in the meditation of God's name. There can be no worship without performing good deeds. There are three key types of seva through which Sikhs involve in. One is through the body, tan, which is through our mental through the body. Two, through our mental capabilities, man, and three, materially, tan. Seva using the body, tan, was not only sanctified by the Gurus, they also institutionalized it through the Guru Kalangar, the Guru's free community kitchen, and the serving of the Sangat, the congregation, by preparing food, cooking food, and feeding the congregation. It is also imperative to serve the society we live in through our mind. Seva through dan, material wealth, is done by contributing 1/10 of our income, daswan, to charitable causes. Now, COVID-19 has brought to the fore the Sikh practice of seva, service which expresses oneness and love. When the first lockdown was announced on the 23rd of March 2020, people of faith had to close their places of worship. Easter and Passover and Ramadan were celebrated physically apart. On the 31st of October, the Prime Minister announced a second lockdown, a lockdown that once again fell during a period of important festivals, such as Diwali, Bandi Chor Divas, and most importantly, Guru Nanak's Gurpurb, birth anniversary for the Sikhs. The lockdown required places of worship to be open for individual prayer only, but it is important to note our places of worship have never really been closed. They are just doing things a little bit differently, particularly with reference to service. And it's important to note that they are guided by the principle of service and helping people, but also our places of worship are there to strengthen people's hope. In the Sikh instance, Sikh Gurdwaras have continued to prepare food which is distributed to the vulnerable and elderly, but also those in financial difficulty. For example, in Scotland, there is the Sikh Food Bank, which has volunteers located in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, and Dundee. And it has been providing food delivery parcels, and I think also friendly calls and welfare support to the community. It is noted that they have delivered over 80,000 meals and food parcels to families. Now, in England, we have Sikh organisations like Nishkam Swat, Midland Langar Seva Society, Sikh Soup Kitchen in Birmingham, the Sri Guru Singh Sabha Gurdwara in London, who have all been serving the wider community. Globally, we've also witnessed the same. In Delhi, since the start of the COVID-19 lockdown, food has been cooked and prepared every day at the Gurdwara Bangla Sahib to feed the migrant workers who were left jobless in the early days of the lockdown in India. Recently, the Gurdwara there has also started an initiative called Meals on Wheels Langar to take food to the remote corners of the city and to villages to serve the elderly and the poor. A recent New York Times article has highlighted the American experience of Langar, highlighting both how Sikhs ran kitchens to serve those in need due to COVID-19, as well as the protesters of the Black Lives Matter movement. There has also been a concerted effort by Gurdwaras to ensure that they stay in touch with those who are socially isolated, whether by phone or a quick visit at the door, socially distant though. Wherever they are serving, Sikh volunteers are serving with a labour of love, which is performed through compassion, humility, and understanding, without desire, nishkam, without intention, nishkpat, and with humility, nimrata. Most importantly, with a recognition of the interconnectedness and oneness of humanity, and that the divine light permeates every person and every aspect of our world. My biggest concern, and that is from a recognition of my own privilege, is the impact that COVID-19 has had, particularly on young people who will have a difficult future ahead of them due to employment crisis, and many are beginning to experience mental health issues. I'm worried about those parents who have lost jobs, children who will not have a hot meal, and those elderly parents and grandparents who are staying at home this winter to protect themselves but cannot afford to keep the heating on, for example. And for them, it is a choice between food and warmth. And we all need to address this because the pandemic has shown the world that we have more in common that brings us together than that divides us. And as we progress through this pandemic and once out of the pandemic, I wish to see this concept of service, which I want to emphasize has existed before the pandemic, but has been evidenced ever so more during the pandemic, to flourish even further so that we can help all to flourish. Service should not be seen just merely as an act of charity, but a way of flourishing through interdependence, through a recognition of kinship with others, the oneness of humanity. On a final note, if the strength of what one faith community is doing is great, then just think of the strength of the many together, which will be even greater. This is something that we saw and as Rose mentioned at the start of the pandemic. What has impressed me to date is the interfaith work being done, because there is a recognition that if we separate and isolate ourselves, then we are far less than what our potential could be when we all work together. Service to each other, when done together with a loving heart, has maximum impact and affirms human dignity and increases the bond of community by fostering respect. Finally, Seva is the knot that ties us all together and creates that community and family. And as we continue to move through this pandemic and eventually out of it, this service and desire to serve will continue because we are guided by, I note in our final line in our prayer, the Adas, Nanak Naam Chardi Kala Tere Pane Sarbat Da Pala, which seeks the blessing for the well-being of all humanity, prosperity for everyone in the world and community, and global peace for the entire planet. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Rabbi Moshe Rubin. Rabbi Rubin was born in Brooklyn in New York in 1969. His teen years were spent in Israel and then Manchester, and then he moved to Scotland in 1989 after getting married. He served Giffnock Synagogue as youth rabbi from 1991 and was appointed as senior rabbi to Giffnock and Newland Synagogue in 1999. In 2012, Rabbi Rubin was appointed senior rabbi to Scotland, and his current roles include chaplain to Calderwood Lodge Primary School and Jewish Care Scotland. He has no fewer than 8 children and a veritable clan of grandchildren spread across the US and Israel. Welcome, Rabbi Rubin. Thank you for being with us this evening. Over to you.
Thank you for inviting me to this evening. And I'm sorry I couldn't be at the beginning, and I'm not sure if I will be able to stay to the very end, but I'll try to stay as much as I can. I begin by stating that the thoughts I share this evening are done in memory of the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. May his dear soul rest in peace. Since Saturday night, when I learned of his sad passing, his teachings have been running through my head. And every time I sat down to write out my thoughts for tonight, all I can think about is what would have Rabbi Sachs said this evening. Then I realized that actually all of Rabbi Sachs' teachings are about the vital need of kindness to ourselves and to others in order to achieve a safe and healthy community, both local community and international community. In his final weekly covenant and conversation essay that was just published last week, 2-3 days before his sad passing, his message seems to be his spiritual will to us. Through the words of the Torah, in it he contrasts Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and Abraham. Through the words of the Torah describing their lives, the key message in all of it is responsibility. When God confronts Adam and Eve about why they ate of the forbidden tree, Adam blames Eve and Eve blames the serpent. They seem to try to get out of being blamed by passing the buck. In the words of the chief rabbi, it is as if they deny being the authors of their own stories. A real failure in responsibility. Cain, after killing his brother Abel, might take some responsibility for his action, as he doesn't blame anyone else. Instead, he fails in moral responsibility by disconnecting himself and saying, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Noah, says the chief rabbi, fails in collective responsibility. He saves his family and animals, but at no point does he plead with God to save the world and not bring the flood. Abraham comes along and all this changes. We learn about how him and his nephew Lot have their differences, but never is there recriminations and blame. When this same nephew is in trouble and kidnapped, Abraham takes a major risk to his life and saves his nephew. When the city of Sodom and Gomorrah is being prepared for destruction, Abraham pleads and gives one of the most remarkable speeches in the Torah to beg God to save these corrupt and immoral people. Abraham teaches us how to take personal responsibility, moral responsibility, and collective responsibility. In other words, Rabbi Sachs is teaching us that to nurture a community spirit, each and every member of that community must take personal responsibility, moral responsibility, and collective responsibility. There's a very interesting Jewish law that if your local community is suffering for whatever reason, be it famine, war, or illness, it is important that the private citizen of that community curtail their own pleasures in order to show their solidarity with the rest of the community. During World War I, when millions of young men were put in harm's way, Rabbi Kagan, the leading rabbinical authority of the time, refused to sleep in the comforts of his own bed and instead slept on the hard floor in order to show his solidarity with these millions of young men. And he was in his 80s at the time. One of the first thoughts I learned from Rabbi Sachs was one that has guided me ever since. The Jewish law requires that after finishing eating a meal or snack, that we say a blessing to thank God. In one of these blessings, there is a seemingly difficult to understand thank you. The blessing is strange, because in the blessing we say, Borei nefashot rabot v'chesronam. We thank God who creates many souls and their deficiencies. Understood literally, it is almost incomprehensible. Why should we praise God who creates deficiencies? Rabbi Sachs answers, if we had no deficiencies, then lacking nothing, we would never need anyone else. We would be solitary rather than social. The fact that we are all different and all have deficiencies means that we need one another. What you lack, I may have, and what I lack, you may have. It is by coming together that we can each give the other something he or she lacks. It is our deficiencies and differences that brings us together in mutual gain, a win-win scenario. Rabbi Sachs concludes, it is our diversity that makes us social animals. In summary, the way we generate and nurture a communal spirit is by recognizing how much we depend on each other, how each one of us has so much to offer to the community, and how the community has equally so much to offer us. Recognizing is not enough. It is actually a responsibility of each and every member of a society to be cognizant of the community around them. COVID has been devastating to many and frightening for others. It has caused loneliness to millions and terrible financial burden for others. So it has been so inspiring to see how communities up and down the country and throughout the world have come together and worked hard and been very creative to help one another during these times of crisis. However, fatigue can set in, and we can slowly go back to those pre-lockdown days and become more focused on our own lives. Rabbi Sachs' message was to us that helping others does not only benefit the other, it actually benefits ourselves. Nurturing a communal spirit not only benefits the community, it is also more so benefits each and every one of that community, and ultimately helps create a better society and world. Let me finish with a very, very cute story. A leader in industry was approached the great Rabbi Schneerson, leader of the Chabad movement, complaining that they feel very lonely at work. They have no friends, they feel disliked by others, and they really don't enjoy the high-powered job they have. Rabbi Schneerson inquired about how their day at work goes. So this CEO began describing how the day begins. First, there is making themselves a coffee, goes into the office, reads the many important briefs, and makes a schedule for the day. Rabbi Schneerson then suggested to the person, tomorrow, when you arrive at work, and you go to the coffee machine, make yourself a coffee, and then make three fellow office workers a coffee. Do this for a few days and then see how things go. A few weeks later, they reported back to Rabbi Sneerson that life has changed. The atmosphere at the office feels so much better. There is respect amongst the workers, and everyone is not only trying to help themselves, but helping one another, which makes the whole company more productive. This is what Rabbi Sachs meant by teaching us that by giving, you're actually receiving. This is how we nurture a community spirit. I thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts and pray for a safe and united community and community of the world. Thank you.
So Parami Macmillan is our third speaker. She's a senior teacher in the Triratna Buddhist community. She was ordained in 1980. She spent the last 40 years living in Buddhist communities, helping to found various urban Buddhist centers and teaching across the globe, especially in the Spanish-speaking world. Recently, she returned to live in her native Glasgow, where she's involved in the Triratna Buddhist community Scotland-wide. Welcome, Parami. Very much looking forward to hearing your contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. So 2020, what a year so far, eh? It's been quite something. So my contribution will be quite practical, I think. I just really want to share with you some of the initiatives that our community has taken on. But beforehand, just to say the background to anything that I say is the Buddhist value, a couple of Buddhist values or qualities, one of which is metta or maitri, which is translatable as loving kindness, universal loving kindness. And the other one is dana, which is generosity and a kind of moving out of self-centeredness to give. So yeah, there's been within our community, as in probably all of our communities, many individual responses to the COVID pandemic. And, you know, I'm sure many of us have been doing volunteer work in all sorts of different fields. But what I wanted to share with you really was a bit more about our response as a community, to some extent as a community for ourselves as a community, and to some extent our community giving outwards. So we're an international Buddhist community. I think we've got groups, centres, rural or urban centres in 29 countries, and most, other than Africa, in every continent. So we're quite varied in our cultural kind of backgrounds. And because we are international for quite a long time, I can't remember how many years, about 8 or 9, we've had a very strong online presence. We have a platform called the Buddhist Centre Online, which is Triratna, but actually a lot of other Buddhists also use it. So as soon as lockdown happened in various different countries, particularly in Spain, which was a bit earlier than us, and then here in the UK in March, we just took virtually everything online. So our local centres started to do their teaching online. But because we wanted to create a sense of community, and because we were very aware that many people would be feeling isolated and would be finding it difficult to connect, particularly older, more vulnerable members of the community, we set up 2 initiatives to deal with that. One of them was a meditation online, 3 times a day, 6 days a week. We've been offering a communal meditation practice. And to begin with, there were about 100 to 150 people sitting together across the world. We do it in 3 times through the day to deal with the different time zones. And that's been really important for many, many people who would perhaps go to a Buddhist centre locally to meditate together. We also set up something we called a toolkit for difficult times, or something like that. A toolkit for troubled times, I think that's what it was. And on that, we had lots of podcasts and talks, and just trying to help people to stay inspired, to stay creative, and to stay in touch with each other. We were also aware that some people aren't online, and that even some who are online don't find it a comfortable medium. So through our kind of international network, we tried to make sure that everybody was in touch with somebody, if you see what I mean, trying to make sure nobody fell through the cracks. Some of us have counselling backgrounds and we used that. And I, for example, was volunteering for a while in Glasgow, doing a listening service, not for our community, generally in Glasgow. Other people were doing other things. But I wanted to share, because we are international, we became aware quite quickly that some places were struggling much more than others, much more than here in the UK, for example. So particularly India, where we've got quite a strong and large presence, and also in Venezuela. In India, we have a charity based in the UK called the Karuna Trust, which means compassion. Karuna means compassion. And we very quickly became aware that India was struggling massively with the pandemic. And I would look today, there have been 128,000 deaths in India since March. There's currently about 500,000 live cases, and there's been over 9 million cases since the beginning of March. So the infrastructure in India can't cope with that. So our charity here immediately set up, I think by the middle of March or maybe the end of March, set up a particular fund, a coronavirus fund for India. And they've raised, I think, about £300,000. And that money's not going to our community, it's being given to our community to use, particularly in rural situations where it's hard for people to get even food at the moment. So people in India from our community have been out of the streets and dishing out, handing out food where they can, medicine, helping people get access to medicine. So that's been a really important part of our community work. And then in Venezuela, we've got a very small but incredibly active community in Merida, which is just in the foothills of the Alps. And it's very hard to know what the pandemic's doing in Venezuela because the government is giving no information to anybody. So as far as we know, there's a lot of cases. And one thing that we do know is that it's very difficult for the hospitals to get what they need. So our community there set up a little sewing project. So they're making PPE, they're making masks and aprons to PPE standard and giving them to the local hospitals and hospices. And I can't remember how many they've managed to do in that time, but they've made quite a big difference. So there are a couple of the projects that I wanted to share with you. I wanted to think about kindness, and one of the things that struck me, and I don't know if others have discovered this, but it seems to me it's a bit harder sometimes to be kind online. But I think it's very easy online to actually forget that the person that you're chatting to is actually a human being with feelings and responses. And I think it's very easy sometimes to say things you wouldn't actually say if you were sitting in a room with somebody. And we found that a little bit on our online fora. We have fora discussing all sorts of things, particularly the Black Lives Matter and climate change have proven to be the two most controversial issues that we've had discussions about. And there's been a bit of polarisation between people who think it's too political, and as a Buddhist community, we shouldn't be engaging with that. I don't personally agree with that. And those of us who think these are not political issues, they're humane issues and they're moral issues, and we should be engaging with them. And occasionally the discussion between these points of view has got a little on the harsh side. So I'm actually the chair of the board of our Buddhist Centre Online. So we've had to intervene a couple of times and remind people that Buddhists take a precept of kindly speech. And that's been good, actually, and people have responded very well. I mean, it's not as bad as Twitter, don't get me wrong. And it's nothing like Facebook, but sometimes people just forget, I think, who they're talking to. So just to finish, it's been interesting seeing the response to the news about a vaccine. And most people have seen that as hopeful. And I have to confess, I've been a little bit concerned myself. I think it's wonderful. I hope it works. I hope it's made available as soon as it's being advertised to be. But I kind of have questions. One of them is who gets this vaccine? And I don't mean individually, but I mean more nationally. Which nations will actually get access to this vaccine? Will it go the same way as the HIV medicines, where places like India couldn't afford to get them and weren't allowed to make their own? So I have questions about that. But my bigger question is that I think people are seeing this as a going back to business as normal. And I really don't hope we don't go back to business as normal, because I think business as normal was not great in so many ways. You know, the world wasn't that fabulous a place pre-COVID. There were all sorts of issues: the climate emergency, poverty, racism, homophobia. These problems existed. And I don't want us just to go back to business as usual. I want us to keep in mind the kindness and sense of community that we've been hearing about today, and that I think most of us have probably felt has been augmented by the conditions of the pandemic. I don't want the new normal just to be the same as it was before. Whatever emerges as a new normal, I really hope that as a Buddhist community, we can contribute to it being something that has values of peace and equity and care and love and compassion. And if I may, I'd like to finish with a couple of quotes. I think I've got time. I'm sorry, I've lost track, but I think I've got time to share a couple of quotes with you. So first quote's from our very own First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, who today in her briefing said something which really jumped out at me. She said, "Throughout this pandemic, we've seen that solidarity and a sense of community spirit plays an important role in getting us through these past few months. That sense of kindness and solidarity will also be really important during the winter period. Support networks will be especially important to people at risk, older and disabled people, to those who are on their own or are feeling lonely." And I think that's a very important message. She did send a message to the interfaith communities recently. And I really hope that as communities, we can bear that in mind as we move into whatever the next phase might be. And I'll leave you with the Dalai Lama, if I may, who's an inspiration to many Buddhists and many non-Buddhists across the globe. He sent a message yesterday to President-elect Joe Biden, in which he said, "I hope you will be able to contribute to shaping a more peaceful world in which people suffering poverty and injustice find relief. The need to address these issues, as well as climate change, indeed remain pressing." So my hope is that all of us as faith practitioners, or people of no faith, specific faith, but of the faith of love and kindness and compassion, can really work together to try and make that not just a dream that somebody, you know, says to a president, but actually is what we really put ourselves behind. Thank you.
So our final speaker is Reverend Canon Professor David Jasper, who's Emeritus Professor of Literature and Theology at the University of Glasgow. For many years, he was also Changjiang Chair Professor at Renmin University of China, Beijing, and has also taught in India, the USA, and Australia. He's been an Anglican Christian priest for 43 years and is Canon Theologian of St. Mary's Cathedral, Glasgow. At present, he's priest in charge of 3 Episcopal churches on the south side of Glasgow, so is no doubt extremely busy. Lovely to have you with us, David. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The English word kindness has its roots in the sense of kinship or near relationship, one's kin or family, and the natural affection that arises from this. It's a gentle word that embraces feelings of tenderness or fondness, affection and love. In the Hebrew Bible, kindness begins with God himself, a covenant word that describes God's nature towards his people. As we've heard this evening, it's sometimes translated in the Psalms as the English loving kindness, the loving kindness of God for his people. And the same word is also translated as mercy. In the New Testament, the teachings of Jesus continue this tradition, demanding that those who listen to him should be merciful and kind, even as God is merciful and kind. Love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. St. Paul, writing to the Christians in Ephesus, also speaks in this way of forgiveness and kindness. Put away all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander, together with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ has forgiven you. So loving kindness is also merciful. It's also forgiving, not once or twice, but infinitely forgiving. But if kindness is of the nature of God, we fall far short of such perfection. The English poet George Herbert writes in his most famous poem, Love, of the call of God. Love bade me welcome. And yet he describes himself, the human speaker, significantly as I, the unkind, ungrateful, I cannot look on thee. And yet as often as we stumble in our lives as human beings, we are forgiven by the infinite kindness and mercy of God. The Christian tradition speaks also of the whole creation as participating in the kindliness of its creator. An English hymn begins, kindly spring again is here, trees and fields in bloom appear. And so we need to reflect this evening as well on the unkindness that we have wrought upon nature as we've ravaged its resources and the beauties of the world. How often we carelessly and unkindly treat the world around us. And perhaps the pandemic itself is a result of such unkindness. So being kind to one another is a lesson we are first taught in elementary, primary school, but it's the hardest of all lessons to remember in our inevitable moments of carelessness, anger, and rage. When God in Christ speaks of his family, he speaks of all people. And when we commit an act of unkindness to our fellow human beings, we commit an unkindness to God. And so then, as we consider our current predicament and the world around us, how much of the suffering and destruction that we see and feel at the present time is the consequence of human carelessness and unkindness. The current COVID epidemic is not an act of God, I don't think for 1 minute, but actually very largely the result of human behavior. And in political life every day, we hear truth, another word in the panoply of kindness, being surrendered at the feet of expediency in the love of power. Truth is also an element then in loving kindness, and it sometimes can be difficult to admit the truth and easier to avoid it. We've recently celebrated in the Christian tradition the festival of All Saints. And I've always thought of saints not as of great and unattainable people, but basically the kindly people of the world, whose lives make a difference for the good, and who throw a beam of the loving kindness of the Lord upon our earth, making our lives better and not worse. And so one final word then. Of course, I don't limit all that I've said in any way to one particular religious tradition, least of all Christianity. Such teaching of the need for kindliness is for all people and is to be found everywhere and in every place, as we've heard this evening. And I join in our hopes that our post-COVID world will be better than our pre-COVID world. In one of his most inspired moments in his letters, St. Paul writes to the church in Corinth of a still more excellent way. It's the way of love, and this is how he defines it. Love is patient, love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. This is the way I feel that we're all seeking to follow. And a world thus governed by love and kindness would be a better place for all of us in all our communities and between them and throughout the world. They're not difficult words, nor are they hard to understand, but to live by them needs infinite practice and care. Of certain men and women of kindliness in the early Christian church, it was once said that through them the world is kept in being, and through them too human life is preserved and honoured by God. Perhaps that's what we all seek, and in such people, God is recognising something of his own nature here on earth. Thank you.
So firstly, a huge thank you to all our wonderful speakers and to our facilitators and to all of you for being here this evening. So much to reflect on, so much to be inspired by and heartened by, as many of you have said. I found it a very uplifting experience being with you all as well. And I hope that there's positive things that we can all take away from this evening. Before closing tonight's event, I'm going to ask that we just pause briefly and spend a moment in silence together to reflect on what we've heard tonight, to let our thoughts settle, and to help whatever it is that we need to take away with us tonight bed down a little. Katie's going to put a candle on the screen. If you could make sure your mics are muted, and we'll just be silent for 30 seconds. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you for the candle, Katie.